What Major K Squad thought was that this guy had some sort of explosive disorder. The original suspect they named was named Michael, and they originally named him. And in the Cold Justice episode basically aligned with what Major K Squad said, and aligned with what probably every prior detective that worked this case said, right? I didn't agree with that because it lacked motive to me.
That's Detective Scott Worth. He spent over 20 years with the Creve Coeur Police Department, and around 2014, he started reinvestigating Elizabeth's murder. In the last episode, you heard him talk about how the original police investigation played out in 1990, and how, by the time he started looking at the case, there was very little remaining evidence to work with. In this episode, Detective Worth will start to lay out his own theory of the case, which differs pretty dramatically from everything the Creve Coeur police had believed before him, and as far as we know, what they still believe today. We've talked about some of the interesting and shady characters around Covenant Seminary in 1990, but as we enter the final phase of this series, we'll start to explore the most interesting and potentially most important characters yet. As the saying goes, the plot thickens in the unsolved murder of Elizabeth McIntosh. This is True Believer, Episode 12, The Secret Admirer.
People generally kill for 3 reasons in homicides, and one of them is revenge. The next one is sex. The next one is money. Now, there may be offshoots of that, but as a homicide detective, you need to know that. You need to know why people kill. And people kill for those 3 reasons, mainly. They're basically the Major K Squad and those detectives from Cold Case show or whatnot. They basically align their beliefs with this was revenge. And the purported revenge was that Elizabeth apparently went over Michael's head about not having enough cleaning supplies on hand for her to do her job as a night janitor, right? And that he went to go discuss it with her that morning because she contempted his authority of some sort of nature, right? And that he's got this explosive disorder and he can't control it, and he ended up killing her in a rage for reporting her for not having enough cleaning supplies on deck for her to do her job. To me, that sounded preposterous. I don't think he's a dumb guy. I really don't. Secondly, the morning they talked to him, because they talked to him early on, that sergeant and that first responding officer spoke to Michael that morning. And Michael said, yeah, I was looking for her because I wanted to talk to her about this whole cleaning supply thing. And they made that out to be the whole reason why Michael apparently, killed Elizabeth. And I just didn't buy it. I didn't think there was enough teeth there. I didn't think there was enough reason or purpose. Maybe there doesn't need to be in a psychological wounded person's head, and maybe that's enough for some people. I just didn't see that it was enough. It didn't seem that way. And I think Michael's a smart enough guy that he wouldn't have told them, not knowing that she had been killed, because he didn't know, I don't think, that she had been killed at that time. She know that, maybe they found her in the bathroom, but he doesn't know all the ins and outs. I don't know that he's been in the bathroom, or they showed her, or anything. I don't think he's seen this scene. All they know is he was going to look for her that morning to talk to her about this conflict. And that was it. And that something about, well, I seen the chair out there, and had a note on it that said, hey, I'm cleaning or whatever, but I didn't dare go in there because she was sensitive about people coming in on the bath. And who wouldn't be? Who wouldn't be? So to me, that seemed like a very honest answer. Like, he put himself right there in the mix. He wouldn't do that knowingly. Like, he would have just been like, what happened? He belongs here. He's a student. Like, you know what I mean? For him to put himself right there in the mix of it, not what a smart guy would do, and he's smarter than that. So that led me to believe that he's being honest. And, a lot of people browbeat him it's been 33 years since her death. So I didn't think that was enough of a reason. So I started going through the case, and I found other means that I thought there was other reasons that were stronger than this one to have ended in her demise.
Why did the investigators at the time so quickly latch on to Michael if the case is so thin?
Michael put himself there at the scene looking for her for reasons of hashing out a small time disagreement, right? And then they blew up into this thing. Oh, well, Michael's got this schizo personality that he can just flip a switch and blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden he flipped a switch because he didn't order enough supplies for the bathroom to be cleaned. So they latched onto it because that's all they had. And you're talking about small town USA. You're talking about Creve Coeur. You're talking about a seminary. You're talking about a very shocking, newsworthy, horrific, bad PR for your neighborhood and tourism type of thing, right? Yeah, there's pressure. There's political pressure. And not only that, then you got the major case squad come in. We're the major case squad. We clear, blah, 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 like very proud of like what they do. But sometimes there's just a crime that they can't clear or can't close. And they never did. They never closed this. They never made an arrest or anything like that. There wasn't enough evidence to prove a case. And, I think the prosecutors rightly didn't charge at the time. And, still, I don't think there's enough evidence to charge. On the cold justice report, they, said, well, I'm going to talk to the prosecutor, and this is a good case, even though it's circumstantial. I'm like, well, I got a lot more circumstantial evidence that I could put on another suspect other than Michael. Through interviews I conducted, I spoke to one of Elizabeth's friends, and she said she had spoke to the major case squad in 1990, and she told them about a situation where she believed Elizabeth had a secret admirer.
There's a lot to unpack with this theory, but we need to preface it with a couple things. First, who is the secret admirer? Well, we still don't know. As you'll hear, Elizabeth did know the man's identity, although as far as we're aware, she never told anyone else who it was. So it's only a secret to us. This becomes very important, as you'll hear. And in the most recent episode, we talked about a few shady characters and a person who was leaving notes for a woman on campus. But based on the context of everything we've seen and heard, it seems pretty clear that none of those men were the secret admirer. So with that in mind, here's what we do know. About a month before the murder, Elizabeth went to see a movie with a friend from Providence Church, whom we'll call Lydia. She didn't want us to use her real name. Ironically, the film Elizabeth and Lydia saw was Woody Allen's Crimes and Misdemeanors, which is about a man who gets away with the murder of his mistress to keep his wife from finding out. After the movie, Elizabeth told Lydia that she couldn't go to the Covenant Seminary library anymore because someone was attracted to her. The man was married, Elizabeth said, and if his wife had any idea he was unfaithful, she would put all his belongings in the front yard. Lydia told police about the secret admirer on the day of the murder. She was pretty sure the man was younger than Elizabeth and also a student at Covenant, because he was hanging around her while she was at the library. But Elizabeth never told her the man's name. And Lydia wasn't the only person who told police about a possible secret admirer that day. Elizabeth's pastor at Providence Church, David Weinkoff, made a phone call to the police at about 2 p.m. He told them that he had information about Elizabeth, so 2 detectives went immediately to interview him at his home. David told them about the conversation he and Elizabeth had had the night before after the Providence Church Sunday evening service. She wanted to talk to him about her recent argument with Ruth, the psychotherapist. And David told the detectives that he was sure Elizabeth would not have killed herself. Remember that at this point in the day, one of the main rumors going around was that Elizabeth had died by suicide. Police, of course, were treating it like a homicide, but many people didn't know that yet. So David's interview ended there, and the detectives returned to Covenant's campus. But then around 6 p.m., David called the police again. He said that after the detectives left his home, he received phone calls from 2 different women from his church who were also friends of Elizabeth's. Both women told him that a married man at the seminary had romantically approached Elizabeth and that she had turned him down. David told the police that both women identified the man as Michael, who at that point was already becoming the police's prime suspect. Now, we need to pause here because there's several different threads to explore from this one story. We're going to try to keep it as clear as possible, but it does get a little bit messy. So we'll start with Michael, since we're already familiar with his story. During his interview with police on the night of the murder, which was a couple hours after David Weinkauf told them about the secret admirer, they asked Michael about any romantic interest that he may have had in Elizabeth.
We got somewhere along the line again where you interview so many doggone people today that somebody mentioned something to the effect that they thought that maybe you were kind of interested in Elizabeth.
Interested?
Yeah, that came up somewhere along the line.
Yeah, well, I don't know.
Not necessarily, a toward of romance or anything, but hey, everybody once in a while, Huh?
There wasn't anything like that.
Well, yeah, how would you answer that? I mean, we heard that. I think somebody mentioned that.
I think that was a little, I have a feeling you're pulling my leg.
Why would you say that?
I don't know.
How do you find that funny?
There wasn't anything like that. I tended to stay. I tended to stay away from her because I could never know what she was. We chatted and stuff like that. But
Well, she's a nice person.
nice person, but
Not bad looking for her age.
she was a. Huh?
Not bad looking for her age, was she? I mean, I've seen pictures
No.
of her.
I didn't necessarily think she was particularly attractive, but I really did.
As you heard there, Michael literally laughed at the idea that he'd have any romantic interest in Elizabeth, and the police seemed to believe him. Based on the audio recordings and police reports that we've had access to, that's the only time the police ever asked Michael about it. Despite being the prime suspect, the police never used the secret admirer connection as part of their case against Michael. Here's Ruth.
Yeah, so what's interesting about this little clip is, so it's the day of the murder. Police have already talked to, at this point, dozens of people, but they've made a special point of pulling in Michael because they think he's important. And you can see that they're kind of asking their way around different possible motives, even maybe for something as serious as murder. And so they're asking him about cleaning supplies, they're asking him, did you guys ever have fights? And then this other little possibility gets slipped in. Oh, did you guys like each other? Were you involved? And you can see that he laughs it off and they don't pursue it. And then that really is kind of the only time that we hear the police directly bring up this idea with Michael. It basically seems like they dropped it and they went in a totally different direction with their theory of the case, and they became pretty committed to this idea of a workplace conflict being the motivation for a murder, and we really never see alternative motives get revisited by the initial homicide detectives.
So now back to David Weinkauf's second phone call with the police. There's a discrepancy between the stories that David, Elizabeth's pastor, and Lydia, Elizabeth's friend, told police. David says he heard the identity of the secret admirer from Lydia, but in 2 different interviews with the police, Lydia said that she did not know who the secret admirer was. Now, I've personally spoken with Lydia, and not only is she emphatic that she never knew who the secret admirer was, she says that it would have been impossible for her to name Michael. She wasn't a student at Covenant, and she had no idea who Michael was until after he became the prime suspect. Elizabeth never talked to her about Michael, or the disagreements that she was having with him over the cleaning supplies. The second woman who supposedly called David Weinkauf was Mary, Elizabeth's best friend, prayer partner, and the wife of another Covenant student. Mary and her husband Mike also went to Providence Church with Elizabeth, Lydia, and David Weinkauf. Now let's pause for a second. Michael, who was the prime suspect and Elizabeth's boss, you already know very well from this series. So this new man, Mary's husband, we're going to refer to as Mike. He's brand new to the story. So, Michael and Mike. We know they have the same name. It's even more confusing, but again, we're going to try to keep it as clear as possible. According to Lydia, she called Mary on the day of the murder to talk to her about the secret admirer. But to Lydia's surprise, Mary knew nothing about it. Elizabeth never told her. And this made Lydia wonder if Mary's husband Mike could be the secret admirer. Why else wouldn't Elizabeth tell her best friend about it? So Lydia claims that's why she called David Weinkauf that afternoon, to get his opinion on this whole situation. When she told David about the secret admirer and her idea that maybe it was Mike, David's response was, "Well, you know he didn't kill Elizabeth, right?" This was even more suspicious to Lydia because David did not dismiss the idea that Mike was the secret admirer. He just denied that Mike killed her. This raises questions about what more David Weinkauf may have known, but we'll talk a lot more about that in the coming episodes. The last person who told police about the secret admirer on the day of the murder was Elizabeth's roommate, Chris. Her first interview was at 2:15 p.m., and while she told detectives about Elizabeth's personal struggles with wanting to be married, she said nothing about the secret admirer. But then at 6:30 p.m., the police reconnected with her, and this time they brought her to the Creve Coeur police station to be re-interviewed. Presumably this was because the police had just gotten off the phone with David Weinkauf, who told them about the secret admirer. That's the first thing Chris told the police about in her second interview at the station. She said that in December 1989, Elizabeth was approached by a male student on campus who wanted to have an affair with her. But just like with Lydia, Elizabeth did not tell Chris who the man was. Chris did tell police about Rod, the married man we talked about in the last episode, who told Elizabeth he found her attractive. But as I said before, based on the context, it seems pretty clear that the secret admirer was a different man. From the first time I read through the police reports, which was almost a year ago now, the single biggest mystery to me has been why the police didn't immediately follow up on the discrepancies between David Weinkauf, Mary, and Lydia. Even a cursory reading of their statements shows obvious discrepancies, and it's baffled me why the police didn't want to get to the bottom of it. Elizabeth had just been murdered on a seminary campus, and within hours, several people reported to the police that a fellow seminary student was possibly making unwanted sexual advances towards her. So why didn't the police seem to care about that? Here's Ruth.
I totally agree. I feel like it's a missed opportunity and a dropped ball, and it's now very hard to recover questions about whether this mattered. But it seems like an obvious question, right? Somebody is suggesting the possibility of a secret admirer. People involved in that possibility are telling these stories that don't quite make sense, and then we never come back to it. So, what do you think some of the disconnect might be? Wait, what questions do you have?
So many questions. So, first, I don't understand why the police didn't immediately notice, hey, wait a second, these three people are all telling different stories that don't line up. So why didn't they just go back to David and Lydia and Mary and say, hey, Lydia and Mary, David said that you told him who the secret admirer was, but in your interviews with us, you said you didn't know who it was. So what's the deal with that? Or go back to David and say, hey, here's what they told us, which nobody's on the same page here. From the very beginning, it struck me as surely this isn't just total incompetence. I'm sure in the first week when all this is happening, there's probably a fog of war situation. There's all these two-man major case squad teams who are going out and interviewing people. So these two detectives talk to David, and different two detectives talk to Mary, and two other detectives talk to Lydia, and maybe they just didn't know what the other ones were hearing, and so they didn't know that there were discrepancies.
Okay, pause. I feel like there has to be a gap between, I don't think it's fair to say incompetence, but their jobs are to take notes and then compare them.
Right. These reports are being written up, the reports that we are reading, to begin to ask these questions. So I'm assuming it wasn't like they waited 6 months to write these notes. They were writing them in the hours after the interview. So surely someone was aggregating all of these notes and saying, hey, wait a second. And so it's always just confused me, like, how could they have missed this? But it only occurred to me very recently, and we talked about this a little bit earlier in this episode, that maybe it's not that they couldn't connect the dots. Maybe it's that they didn't want to connect the dots. Because, as Scott Worth said earlier, people kill for 3 reasons: revenge, money, or sex. And the police seem to think that Michael is the killer for this revenge motive. Well, if Michael killed Elizabeth because he was angry at her and had all this hatred for her and wanted revenge because she contempted his authority about the cleaning supplies, he probably didn't do that because he was also madly in love with her and wanted to have an affair with her. So these 2 motives of revenge and sex clashed, and the police chose the revenge motive. And so maybe they just didn't want to follow up on these discrepancies that would have led down this trail of sex.
Well, and we've always said too, like, it's not that the cleaning supplies fight doesn't make any sense. It does make some sense as a possible motive, but it also is, like, not really that big of a deal. And that's been a lot of people's confusion with this case. Like, are you saying that this person killed someone over a fight over cleaning supplies because of how she responded to him? And so the secret admirer theory has holes in it too, for sure. And we certainly could not say that even if we did know who the secret admirer was, that he killed her. But it's at least, like, as plausible as another reason. And I agree, it still confuses me why it wasn't given more attention. One of the things that we talked about a little bit is the possibility that just the fact that there was a name, Michael, that 2 people had, Mike and Michael, might have caused a mix-up when David was telling the story over the phone or when the officer was taking the story down in his notes. And maybe that then led to a transposal of, oh, maybe Michael, the prime suspect, is the secret admirer. And maybe nobody went back and caught that error. But I don't know.
Yes, that is a definite possibility because these guys had the same name. However, it seems very unlikely that David Weinkauf would have been confused. Lydia actually said Mike, and he thought Michael, Elizabeth's boss, who became the prime suspect. As far as we know, David Weinkauf did not know Michael, had never met him, and Mike went to David's church, and so he would have been very well acquainted with Mary and Mike. So I don't think that he could have gotten confused about that. Yes, it's possible that the officer who was writing the report or taking notes as he's telling them this over the phone, hears the name Mike, thinks Michael because the police have already been talking about Michael. But even that seems unlikely because, we're not using last names in this series for the most part, but Michael and Mike's last names sound nothing alike. Presumably David would have used the last name when he communicated this. So I don't really see how that's a possibility. And so if it wasn't a mix-up, then really this leaves this other possibility, which is that David Weinkauf called the police and lied to them about what Mary and Lydia told him. Now, what possible reason would David Weinkauf have to call the police and lie to them? That seems crazy. Well, I've said it 1,000 times. This is the time when you do a shot every time I say this, but we're going to be talking about this in future episodes. But we're just putting it out there that is something that we're going to be discussing.
Yeah, you could speculate endlessly about all the different threads of these phone calls and the stories about the secret admirer. We're not trying to speculate endlessly, I promise. But we can't get to the truth without talking about some of the possibilities and what they might mean for the case.
Now, let's talk about Mary's husband, Mike, and the reason he became so important to the police. Back in episode 4, we briefly touched on this and said we'd come back to it. Here's Detectives Dennis Spory and George Hodak.
We started interviewing a number of people. suspects, witnesses, somebody. You're starting to just interview a lot of people to see if they saw or heard anything, or if they know anything.
And we found, I don't know if we found him that day or the next, but there was that one guy who was adamant. The guy said he was going to go over there.
And it was actually earlier than 6:30.
No, he said 6:30. Yeah, maybe about 6:30 or something like that. And he said it twice, maybe 3 times. He said it during the investigation, I think, and then he said it to Bailey, because Bailey actually met him at the airport.
Right.
And then he's got an audio tape of that one, and the guy says, yeah, he said he was going to go over there at 6:30, or said he was over there at 6:30, and he stayed with that for years.
They're talking about another Covenant student who told police about an appointment Michael supposedly had with Elizabeth at the chapel at 6:30 on the morning of the murder. If you remember, Michael and his wife Jill both claimed that he was still laying in bed at 6:30 that morning. Since the police were looking for ways to poke holes in Michael's timeline and alibi, they were interested in this conflicting story. And the person telling that story, that Hodak and Spory were just talking about, is Mary's husband, Mike. We know, same name. Sorry about that. This story came out of an interview that the police did with Mary, Elizabeth's best friend, on the day of the murder. Mike was there too, and he told the police that earlier that morning he had had a conversation with Michael, who told him that he was supposed to meet with Elizabeth at 6:30 a.m. The police kept in touch with Mike, and they interviewed him several times. Ruth and I have pored over every document that we can get our hands on in this case. Hundreds and hundreds of pages, plus hours of video and audio recordings. And when we've seen people's stories and memories shift over time, we do our best to keep track of those changes. And we're going to take the same approach with Mike. Police have never publicly named him as a person of interest in this case. They needed his story if they were going to make a case against Michael, who was the prime suspect in their eyes. But we think certain parts of Mike's story don't line up either. About a week after the murder, Mike did a phone interview with the police and said that on the day of the murder, he approached Michael and asked him when he had last seen Elizabeth. And Michael told him that he had an appointment to meet with Elizabeth at 6:30 a.m. Mike said that they talked some more, but he couldn't recall the rest of the conversation, or if Michael had actually met up with Elizabeth. So let's pause here for a second. Mike had very clear memories about talking with the prime suspect and the time of his supposed planned meeting with Elizabeth. But it feels like almost anyone would have had a series of logical follow-up questions. Did that meeting happen? Did you see her? Oh, you didn't? Well, why not? But Mike doesn't remember any of those things. That seemed like would have been natural things for him to ask Michael about. And those would have been the most important parts of that conversation. Even if Michael did have a 6:30 appointment to meet with Elizabeth, what's important is whether he was actually there, or whether he actually met with her. So that's all based on Mike's phone interview in April 1990. Then over a year later, in June 1991, the police interviewed Mike again, which we have a video copy of. At the time, Mike was pastoring a church in Springfield, Missouri. Now, the purpose of the 1991 interview is pretty clearly to get Mike on the record again, explicitly stating that Michael told him that he had an appointment with Elizabeth at 6:30 on the morning of the murder. And that part of Mike's story is consistent with what he told police the previous year. But some of the important details surrounding it seem to change. Here's Sergeant Dale Bailey asking Mike to recount his meeting with Michael. And again, keep in mind that you're hearing the voice of Mike, Mary's husband, talking about Michael, the prime suspect.
On the day that Elizabeth's death, you had explained to me that you had had a conversation with Michael. And could you explain how that conversation developed?
Sure. As the morning wore on, it became clear that this was not just a medical emergency, but in fact there was something really awful had happened, that there was a victim. And before the time that we knew who the victim was, there was an intense amount of curiosity about what in the world was going on. And I became very interested in finding out when different people knew. I mean, this may have been an old reporter thing, I don't know, but if you can find someone who knew sooner than everybody else, then that's the person you kind of hang on to and go after to get the information. And I remember asking Mike as we were standing in the library, Buswell Library, when did you find out? When did you find out? Those are my words. And he was standing by the encyclopedias. He was facing the checkout counter. It's across from the card catalog. I was looking at him, which would have meant that my back was to the checkout counter, basically. And without hesitating at all, Mike said about 6:30, because we were going to have a meeting to talk about work. And then he mentioned the chapel. About 6:30, when I was going to the chapel to have a meeting with her about work. I can't give you the verbatim thing because it's been a year. It didn't stick in my mind as a particularly early time to find out, and I just dropped it at that point. So that's pretty much what happened.
Okay, so that it's clear in the taping as to what's the important part of this. The question that you'd ask him had to do with when he had learned of Elizabeth's death.
Yes, when he had learned that there had been a crime, a homicide. I have to say that because I didn't know it was Elizabeth. I didn't ask him, when did you find out Elizabeth had been killed? And I know that's the case because I was told it was Elizabeth by Tom. And immediately I went home to be with Mary because she was just torn apart. And so I wasn't on campus after I knew it was Elizabeth. I was off campus.
Several things to point out about what Mike just said there. Most importantly, he changes the reason why he approached Michael in the first place. In April 1990, he told police that he asked Michael when he had last seen Elizabeth. Obviously, because Elizabeth had just been found dead, and people on campus were talking about it. But in June 1991, he's explicit that he did not ask Michael about Elizabeth, because he claims he didn't know at that point who the victim was. He told police that he found out later that Elizabeth was the person who died. He said that Michael's response to being asked, "When did you find out?" was about 6:30, when I was going to the chapel to have a meeting with her about work. But who is her? Well, obviously that's Elizabeth. And doesn't that response imply that both men knew who they were talking about? Why has Mike's story changed? It seems highly unlikely that these two men would be explicitly talking about a homicide that just happened on campus, in which Michael already knew that Elizabeth was the victim, and in which Michael mentions that he had a meeting with Elizabeth that morning, but that Mike wouldn't connect the two together. And it's not just that minor details of the story have been slightly modified. The 1991 story directly contradicts his 1990 version of the same story. Here's Sergeant Bailey again, asking Mike when this conversation would have taken place.
Well, I did bring up something I should have asked you. Can you tell me time-wise about when you found out and then about the time that this conversation came up?
Sergeant, it would be speculation for me to do that.
Okay.
I don't know.
Now, at the time that you were in the library, do you recall when that might have been?
It would have been between the hours of 7 and 9. Everything came to a grinding halt. It may seem strange that so many hours elapsed with nobody doing anything, but the tension was tremendous. It would have been around that time, 7 to 9, something like that. Maybe to 10.
Okay, 7 to 9, maybe 10. TJ, this is a big mess, in my opinion. Because this is very important. They're trying to nail down the prime suspect's timeline, but there's pieces about this story that are just strange.
Well, what's odd about Mike's recollection of this encounter is that he has some parts of it are very, almost oddly specific. He can remember Michael's position in the library relative to the encyclopedias and the card catalog and who was facing which direction. But he can't remember where in the 3-hour window this conversation may have taken place, or if it even took place in that 3-hour window.
And we should just note, too, that according to Michael's version of events, He says that he wasn't on campus until a little bit after 7 o'clock, which would have, according to the police, been after Elizabeth died, if that's accurate. And so he went to the chapel, didn't see Elizabeth, came back to the chapel. Then he went home after 8:30 and talked to his wife, Jill, then went back to campus. And at that point, the police kind of corralled him and he gave his written statement at the chapel between 9:30 and 10 a.m. All that to say, it's possible that he was at the library having this conversation with Mike from 7 to 9, maybe 10. But he was also doing a lot of other things and going a lot of other places and talking to a lot of other people. And it's kind of hard just for me personally to understand, like, when you would have had time to have a casual conversation with someone about this crazy thing that just happened. And so I don't know. Am I missing anything there?
No, based on everything we know about his movements from what other people have said in the police reports and what Michael has said, yes, it's theoretically possible he could have just decided, oh, my wife just told me to go back to the chapel because the police might be interested in what I had to say because I was there that morning. And then when he leaves his apartment to go back to the chapel, he encounters this other guy named Floyd who's like, hey, Michael, the police are looking for you because they heard you were here this morning. And so he's already on his way back to the chapel to talk to them. I guess Michael could have decided to just randomly stop off at the library for whatever reason on his way to talk to the police. Yes, it's possible that the conversation took place before 10 a.m., sometime in that morning, but it seems very unlikely.
Well, and part of why we're trying to nail down this conversation when it happened, and I would also say whether it happened, is because one of the important things is Mike's story about whether or not he knew Elizabeth was dead when they had that conversation is also part of his story. At one point he says he did, at another point he says he didn't. But there's also another version, this is getting really confusing, there's also another version where Mary, Mike's wife who's now dead, told police that she and Mike talked about the murder around 7:30 a.m.
Which we have an audio clip of.
Do you remember the day that Elizabeth was killed? Can you recall that?
Well, as I told you before, I was at home, and I had two children that were young and were at home, and one was in school, in junior high, and I earned money by babysitting for a friend's baby, and right before he came to drop the baby off, Mike called me. He had already left. I think he had driven Ben, my son who was in middle school, and then he went to seminary, and he called me from seminary, and it was like 7:30 in the morning to tell me that Elizabeth had been found dead, and that it looked like it might be suicide.
So we bring all this up, like, not to say that we know who the murderer is. And of course, people can have different recollections of events. People can get things wrong. People can remember some things and not others. But when this is one of the most important witnesses in a case, we need to look at their story very carefully. And when things don't line up, I think it's fair to everyone involved to ask why.
It's really two separate things about him. One is this question of, does he line up as a possible secret admirer? But even if you take that completely off the table, that still leaves this thing of his story about talking to Michael in the library. Michael had this 6:30 appointment. That is totally disconnected from the secret admirer. It just happens to be two questionable things about the same person.
Absolutely. Well, and again, police use unreliable narrators, and prosecutors use unreliable narrators all the time to prove a case. But you also need to know that what they're telling you is true. You certainly don't want to convict or prosecute someone based on not just an unreliable narrator, but a false story. That would be the worst possible scenario. And so, again, we're just asking questions about this very important story that helps establish a timeline of the case. If it's not true, this timeline that police are relying on also doesn't make as much sense.
Okay, so now...
Wait, one last thing. We haven't talked about the hypnotist yet, TJ. We both made a note to talk about the hypnotist in this episode, and we didn't. So what do we need to say about that?
In the Major Case Squad report, there's a section of, it's called the lead sheet. So there's all these two-man teams who have been assigned from the Major Case Squad to go out and start interviewing people, collecting evidence, so forth. And there's a list of, it's dozens of things, so these two detectives go interview Bob. These two detectives go interview the president of the seminary. These two detectives go search the dumpster out back to see if there's a weapon in there. And then over the course of the investigation, obviously, certain leads turn up new leads. So there's all these things that they're going to do. So just a minute ago, I talked about this guy, Floyd, that Michael ran into when he was going back to the chapel to talk to the police. Floyd is interesting because he told police that Michael told him that he was trying to talk to Elizabeth that morning at the chapel, but that he did not have a specific appointment with her. On the other hand, Mike has told the police that Michael told him he had a 6:30 a.m. appointment with Elizabeth. So we've got these two guys who have both talked to Michael who are giving different accounts of what Michael told them.
Yeah, so in the lead sheet, there's a note in April that they want to hypnotize Floyd.
And Mike.
Yes. Mike, not the prime suspect, but Mike, this other person, and Floyd. It sounds like they're trying to figure out who was accurate about the prime suspect's movements that day. But somebody stopped them. So there's a note that the PA, the prosecuting attorney, said no. And that was the end of that. But it goes to show you, like, they were really throwing spaghetti at the wall on this case of trying to figure stuff out and willing to go to some interesting lengths to do so.
In previous episodes, you've heard some of our interview with Dave Thompson, who specializes in investigative interview training. Here, Dave talks about Mike's June 1991 interview and how the police may have overlooked inconsistencies in his story because of what they were hoping to get out of him.
I think that's, again, not specific to this case, but that general theme is pretty on point. Almost every false confession case that, I know it's not a confession here, but every false confession case that I've worked, you see the suspect give an admission that's completely wrong, right? They could say, I stabbed her 3 times and she was on the kitchen floor. And the detective knows that's not how she was found. You see that in the next 20 minutes of the interview was you probably didn't stab her 3 times, right? I think it was only once, right? Does that sound more right? And it wasn't in the living room or the kitchen, right? It was in the living room and wasn't she on the couch instead? I think that seems more right. And so it's almost like ignoring the first version of events to just confirm what the investigator, the evidence shows. What's difficult with that is maybe you have somebody who's lying and you're trying to get them to tell the truth, but you need to look at a timeline of when people give you admissions or acknowledgement of information or details, when it changed, what was the catalyst to that change? Was it the detective suggested it should change, refused to accept the denial? If you gave me something and I said, hey, if you don't tell us the truth, you're going to be in a lot of trouble, then all of a sudden it changed. Hey, if you tell us the truth, we're on the same team here, and all of a sudden it changed. And so when I look at the reliability of information, it's looking at what was the trigger to that transition. But what you just said is on point. That's often when people ignore all the other details because the end result is what I was looking for. So who cares it took 30 different versions of a story to get there? That's a problem.
There's one more wrinkle in this part of the story, which we only learned about very recently, and it involves another possible interaction between Michael and Mike earlier on the morning of the murder. As a reminder, Michael told police that he was in the chapel around 7:15 a.m. looking for Elizabeth. He couldn't find her, so he went to the administration building. Then around 8:30, he came back to the chapel to do some cleaning. He re-entered the chapel through the rear basement door and immediately discovered that he was in a crime scene. So he went upstairs to exit the chapel from the main level. And there he encountered a couple, David and Rebecca, who had been asked by the police captain to guard the front door and not let anyone in the building without a police ID. In his interview with police on the night of the murder, Michael said that in addition to David and Rebecca, his boss Tom was also standing there, and that Tom was talking with someone, although Michael doesn't specifically identify who that someone was. Tom eventually went downstairs, and that's when David and Rebecca told Michael that Elizabeth had been found dead and that it was possibly a suicide. But only very recently, we heard a story that Michael later identified the person that Tom was talking to as Mike. Michael claims that he heard Mike saying, "Maybe I should come down there. I knew her pretty well." But then Tom told Mike that wouldn't be a good idea, and Mike walked away. So this is now a second person who claimed that Mike knew about Elizabeth's death much earlier than what he told the police. Whether it was closer to 7:30, as Mary claimed, or 8:30 when Michael claims to have seen him, either of those times would have been before their library conversation could have possibly taken place. And that earlier time fits with what Mike originally told the police, that he asked Michael when he had last seen Elizabeth. Again, why did Mike's story change in June 1991? And just as importantly, why didn't the police catch those changes? So now that you have the background on the secret admirer and the interactions that Mike had with the police, we'll hear from Detective Scott Worth again, talking more about his theory.
Through interviews I conducted, I spoke to one of Elizabeth's friends, and she said she had spoke to the Major Case Squad in 1990. And she told them about a situation where she believed Elizabeth had a secret admirer. She identified that basically she had a carrel next to this secret admirer in the library. And then I started doing background on this secret admirer. And I interviewed his wife, or his ex-wife. She advised that he was abusive. She sent me pictures of her with a black eye. She also said one of their children was disciplined by him at one time with an electrical cord. And also one time that he had cut up her clothes with some scissors. And as a detective, when people act out, sometimes they act out in a way that they do over and over and over again. We call that a modus operandi. And in that, a leopard doesn't change its spots. In the criminal justice world, oftentimes they don't change the way in which they do things. So that was specifically alarming to me with this secret admirer, that he'd use an electrical cord, because we're talking about a murder that used an electrical cord. We're talking about a female that's been beat up by the secret admirer, his ex-wife, and we're talking about the use of purported scissors. And for all intents and purposes, they thought she was stabbed with scissors, even though there was never ever any weapon of that nature recovered at the scene. But the more times I interviewed this particular secret admirer's ex-wife, she advised that she really didn't know where he was on the morning of, the victim's death, and that she was under postpartum depression and often taking sleeping pills or whatnot, and she really couldn't vouch for her own husband's alibi at the time. And then later on, sometime later that day, the secret admirer came home to his wife at the time, ex-wife, and relayed that, Elizabeth had died, and it looked like a suicide, maybe a murder, and, they maybe found a pair of scissors or a knife or something in the ceiling tiles of the bathroom, which really wasn't the case, right? Was never documented. No police ever found any weapon of that nature like that at the scene. So to me, that was very, very telling. Like, I wanted to know about that. Like, that stood out to me. Like, who has inside information? Maybe there was a weapon put in the ceiling tile, and maybe later it was recovered by the suspect themselves. I don't think the ceiling tiles were ever searched. No one was lifting up ceiling tiles in the bathroom or looking behind blank walls, which there was, because later on, years later, I climbed through those ceilings and through those walls in hopes of finding this purported weapon that I was told might be there by this lady who was married to this guy who's a secret admirer.
If it isn't obvious already, Detective Worth believes that Mary's husband, Mike, was the secret admirer. Mary died in 2017, but Detective Worth interviewed her several times over the phone. We played a clip from one of those interviews earlier in this episode. But it's important to say that the secret admirer has never been definitively identified. For now, it's still a theory.
I know the night Elizabeth died, she went to go speak to David Weinkauf, which was purportedly her pastor, and I thought they were friends. And ultimately, when Elizabeth was found, there was a fingerprint found on a letter in the bathroom where Elizabeth's body was found. It was an acceptance letter to Knox University in Florida, or Knox Seminary, and David's fingerprint was on that. And so I had believed at the time that, you know, she showed him the letter the night before she died, and that's why his fingerprint was on there. But I think she also went to David Weinkauf to express that she had been propositioned by this secret admirer, and I think it was her attitude, because she was reportedly a very tough lady. Like, no one was going to tell Elizabeth McIntosh what's what. Like, she went to school with a bunch of men, and she wasn't going to get bulldogged, right? She was a former nurse from Scotland, and she was 50 years old. She's not going to get told by these young kids like what to do or how come or why or anything like that. She's going to stand up for herself. So I think she told David Weinkauf about this proposition of the secret admirer, and the next day she ended up deceased. So I thought that the secret admirer motive for killing her was a lot stronger than what had been previously discovered by the major case squad, and later on, which people wouldn't let go of. It was a whole lot stronger because he had a lot more to lose, this secret admirer, because he was about to be a Presbyterian minister. And if he got ousted as a philanderer, he probably would not have been a Presbyterian minister, and there would have been major backlash and embarrassment for him. Well, we did find out later on, this secret admirer apparently did lose his job in the Presbyterian ministry because exactly that. He was found out to be a philanderer later on in life and basically removed from the Presbyterian ministry. So again, back to people that don't change their motive, okay? You know, I'm not saying once a cheater, always a cheater. Hey, where there's smoke, there's fire, you know? And it's really hard for people to change their behaviors.
Detective Worth is talking about the same conversation we've mentioned many times before between Elizabeth and David Weinkauf after the Sunday night service at Providence Church. Many people, both in the police reports and through conversations that we've had directly, remembered David and Elizabeth having that conversation. Some have characterized it as heated. Some have even said that it seemed like an argument, but no one has been able to independently verify what they discussed, or if there was more to that conversation than what David shared with the police. So, was Elizabeth trying to tell her pastor about this secret admirer? And was the secret admirer her best friend's husband? We may never know for sure. 3 of those people are now dead, and Mike, like Michael, has declined to be interviewed for this project. We've also spoken with several people who knew Mike and Mary over the years, and we've heard interviews that Detective Worth did with some other people. They've confirmed Mary's allegations of domestic abuse, and those allegations weren't new. In the last episode, we talked about psychiatrist Eugene Holman, who treated Covenant's assistant librarian George after his 1971 incident at St. John's Hospital. Holman left Covenant in 1985, but he knew Elizabeth through her counseling practicum. During Holman's interview with police about a week after Elizabeth's murder, he told them that Mike and Mary had sought counseling because Mike had a temper and could turn violent. Mike would suffer periods of depression, and Mary would be his target during these periods, although Holman didn't specify what exactly that violence was. He speculated that if Elizabeth had attempted to counsel Mike, she could have enraged him, making him potentially dangerous to herself. Holman clarified that he didn't know if Elizabeth had actually tried to counsel Mike. He was just guessing about what could have happened. What's interesting is that in one of his phone interviews with Detective Worth, Mike told a story about a time that, according to him, Elizabeth had discreetly confronted Mary about something and called her out. Mike said that he was impressed with Elizabeth because she was able to see what was going on. What a smart woman, Mike said about her. I respected her a great deal. Mike has never been charged with a crime. After leaving Covenant, he pastored a PCA church in Springfield, Missouri, then transferred to the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, or OPC, and moved to Philadelphia. There, he was an assistant pastor and a Bible teacher at a private Christian school. In 2004, the OPC suspended him, and he later resigned as a pastor. In one of his interviews with Detective Worth, which we've reviewed, Mike said that he had an affair with someone, which coincided with his departure from the ministry. Here's Ruth.
So this is tricky and sensitive, but we are including this amount of information about an individual because it is relevant to the case of Elizabeth McIntosh. And as uncomfortable as it might be to talk about allegations of domestic violence and people getting dismissed from the ministry after they went to Covenant, the truth is that we don't know if Mike was the secret admirer. Nobody has ever said directly, other than Scott Worth, the detective, that they think he was connected to the murder of Elizabeth McIntosh. But he is a credible, possible secret admirer of Elizabeth. And we know that that's important to this case. Figuring out that story is important to this case. And so if we learn of anybody else who might have been the secret admirer, we would also look at them. We would also examine whether or not they said things the week of the murder, the month of the murder, the year after, and so on, that line up. We would have asked questions about those discrepancies too. Basically, and that's what the police would do, and prosecutors, if they ever decide to charge someone connected to this case. So again, the truth is important. It could be somebody else that we don't know about, but we're investigating as many avenues as we can, as respectfully as we can, with as much truth as we know. And then we just hope that these stories will open up some doors or avenues that haven't been explored yet. Hey, TJ, this is a last minute addition. I'm actually calling in from my sister's roommate's bedroom in Oklahoma. As we work through this project, when we learn new information or talk to new people, we feel like it's important to add to the episodes. And so I did just want to add that as we worked on this episode, I reached out to Mike's family and asked if there was any new information they could add or anything they wanted to say. And I do feel like it's important to note that basically they stand by their dad. And, I can't get into too much more detail, but I did want to note, one, that they think Mike is innocent of a murder, and two, that they feel like the police and Scott Worth, the detective we heard from in this episode, were really aggressive in how they pursued this theory of the case. And that would probably be true of any person we talked to whose family member was accused of murder by the police. But I do want to make sure that's said in this episode. I don't have a clean ending to it, but that thought needs to be in there.
Maybe we'll just put that in there. There's clean endings are difficult in this series because it's pretty messy and we learn things last minute. And so we're trying to we've already got the episode more or less done and we've kind of just shoehorned this little piece in here because we just learned about it. Days, even hours at this point before we publish. So we're just trying to be as accurate and up to date as possible.
Yeah, that's a good way of framing it. And so again, if anybody has new information for this project, please reach out. Until then, we're just doing what we can with the people who will talk with us.
We've spent most of this series talking about the main police theory, that Michael, Elizabeth's boss on the Covenant Seminary house cleaning staff, killed her in a fit of rage after their disagreement over cleaning supplies. We've now heard an alternate police theory from Detective Scott Worth about Elizabeth's secret admirer, who that might have been, and how that may be a stronger motive for her death. Now it's time for the final chapter of this series, about Elizabeth's pastor, David Weinkauf, what he may have known about Elizabeth's death, and the circumstances surrounding his own premature death on a mountain in Colorado in 1993. Next time. True Believer is written, recorded, edited, mixed, and executive produced by TJ Ingracia. Co-written and co-produced by Ruth Servin Smith. Research and development by Kyle Hackman and Doug Servin. Visit truebelieverpodcast.com to see additional materials related to each episode, or to get in touch with us. If you're someone who knew Elizabeth or have any information related to her or her murder, we'd love to hear from you. Next time on True Believer.
Dave was he was bold too. He wasn't afraid to challenge anybody to live their Christianity outside their comfort zone. And if he got fired up about something, even in a sermon, I mean, he'd say some things that probably be okay to say, to your friends, but not from the pulpit. But that's what he was. He had no fear.
So the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh and the pride of life are topics from which the devil brings most of his arguments to our souls. But it shouldn't surprise us when great Christians are tempted to awful things, because Satan goes after them.